Afternoon. My name is Abayomi Azikiwe, and I am the editor of the Pan-African Newswire. I'm also a co-founder of the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, anti-war group that was formed in Detroit, in the state of Michigan, in the fall of 2002, leading up to the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. I'm also a contributing editor to a Workers' World newspaper that's based here in New York City. And I just wanted to mention that the content of my remarks today, of course, is going to deal with the role of U.S. imperialism primarily on the African continent and its implications for the international community. Now, just this past May 25th represented the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which is the predecessor of the African Union. The African Union consists of 54 member states from throughout the continent who are in principle committed to the unity and the development of this vast region of the world. When the OAU was formed with 32 member states, Africa was at a crossroads in the struggle for national independence and unity. Within the Organization of African Unity itself, there were various political currents. Among them, you had the independent African states, most of whom remained firmly within the economic and political sphere of Western imperialism. This was in 1963. Nonetheless, there was a small number of states on the African continent that sought to break out of the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism to form a bloc of governments that would effectively challenge imperialism. Now, within this anti-imperialist tendency, there were some who called for the immediate unification of the African continent to create a super state that would encompass a common language, a common currency, a common legislature, a common administrative body, as well as a military high command. Now, this group of anti-imperialist leaders came under tremendous pressure by the former and then present colonial powers and the dominant political and economic force within the post-World War II military configuration, which was, of course, the United States of America. Now, in February of 1966, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of the Republic of Ghana and the chief strategist and tactician of the African Revolution, was overthrown at the aegis of the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department in Washington. Now, at the founding meeting of the Organization of African Unity, Dr. Nkrumah wrote to the African heads of state, and he had published a book called Africa Must Unite that was circulated to all the African heads of state in 1963. And just to quote briefly from the book, he said, "Never before in history has such a sweeping fervor for freedom expressed itself in a great mass movement which are driving down the bastions of empire. This wind of change blowing throughout Africa, as I have said before, is no ordinary wind. It is a raging hurricane against which the old order cannot stand," unquote. And that was from Africa Must Unite that was published in 1963. And Nkrumah also went on to point out that, quote, "The great millions of Africa and Asia have grown impatient of being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and are rebelling against the false belief that Providence created some to be menials of others. Hence, the 20th century has become the century of colonial emancipation, the century of continuing revolution, which must finally witness the total liberation of Africa from colonial rule and imperialist exploitation," unquote. Nonetheless, by 1963, Washington remained an aggressive and militaristic world power. In Vietnam, the Kennedy administration had dispatched 7,000 advisors, which served as a gateway into a full-scale occupation of Southeast Asia that took place after the assassination of John F. Kennedy under Lyndon Baines Johnson, and this began in the spring of 1965. By the end of the Johnson administration, in late 1968, early 1969, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops would be stationed in Vietnam, and as a result, over 1 million people were killed throughout the region by the time of the U.S. withdrawal in 1975. The Dominican Republic, right here in the Western Hemisphere, which shares the island of Hispaniola with Haiti, was subjected to a U.S. military intervention also in 1965, which is not as well known, of course, as what happened in Vietnam. Cuba, which organized the revolution against U.S. neocolonialism in 1959, was subjected to decades of destabilization and an economic blockade. During this same time period of the rising African and world liberation movements and socialist consolidation in the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Vietnam, and other regions, the African American people inside the United States were challenging the institutional racism and national oppression which had built the country into a world economic power. The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and the solidarity struggles with Africa and other geopolitical regions of the world had a tremendous impact on the consciousness and international image of the descendants of slaves. Even though these efforts, led by African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and their allies, changed the legal framework of the United States, the fundamental structures of capitalism and the super exploitation remained intact. Today, a renewed struggle for full legalization of immigrant communities and the socioeconomic equality and right to self-determination for Africans and Latin Americans descendants rages on. Now, after giving some historical background and overview of imperialism, I want to discuss imperialism today. And this is subtitled Militarism and the Quest for Strategic Dominance by the United States. Now, during the period of the Vietnam War, there arose a monumental anti-war and peace movement, which played a significant role in the ending of the occupation of Southeast Asia. The anti-imperialist wing of the movement viewed the victory of the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, and the Laotians as a major contribution to the overall struggle for socialism. The Vietnam War had a devastating impact on the economic and political status even of the United States. The rebellions that arose during the 1960s and early 1970s in the United States left large sections of the urban areas in an even more marginalized and exploited condition. These failures of U.S. imperialism, internationally as well as domestically, created the conditions for the large-scale restructuring of industry and commerce. In cities like Detroit, Gary, Indiana, for example, this process led to downsizing, it led to capital flight, and which resulted in the escalation of the rate of joblessness, homelessness, law enforcement repression. Then, of course, during the early 1980s, the U.S. Would pursue a renewed militarist effort with interventions in Lebanon in 1982, where they sent thousands of troops there to try to contain the liberation struggle in Palestine and the struggle for the sovereignty of Lebanon. And then, of course, in 1983 as well, there was the invasion and occupation of Grenada in the Caribbean, a small island nation the size of the city of Detroit, that was invaded by, over 20,000 U.S. troops. And then later, in 1989, in Panama, a somewhat concocted country based upon the economic interests related to the Panama Canal in the southern hemisphere. Culminating, of course, in the invasion of Iraq and the imposition of United Nations-approved sanctions. Of course, Operation Desert Shield, Operation Desert Storm in 1990 and 1991. Then, of course, the consequent sanctions that were approved by the United Nations, which killed over 1 million people in Iraq. And, of course, this had implications throughout the entire region of the Middle East. In 2001, in the aftermath of 9/11, the Bush administration essentially declared war on the world, which precipitated the escalation of the defense budget, the slashing of social programs over the last nearly 12 years, as well as municipal services have declined in cities all across the country. I'm from Detroit. Since we were the most industrialized city in the country, perhaps the world, this major restructuring had a devastating impact on Detroit. We've lost over half of our population. Today, as a result of the impact of home foreclosures, evictions, utility shutoffs, massive municipal debt, they placed the city under emergency management, which is in effect occupation, by the financial institutions in Detroit. And this is happening in cities all across Michigan and even across the country, because we have the bankruptcy of Stockton, California, San Bernardino, California, Jefferson County, Alabama, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. There's a real municipal crisis inside the United States. And as a result of this municipal crisis, we have the institutionalization of austerity, similar to what we see in Southern Europe. It's spreading to Western Europe. They just declared a recession in France recently. In Germany, which was supposed to be like the economic powerhouse of the European Union and the European common market and currency, unemployment is going up in Germany as well. In Britain, of course, we've had the imposition of austerity. They're in a recession. They don't talk about it that much, but it is. In 2008, some 5 years ago, the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, was formed to further intensify this renewed imperialist onslaught on the continent. Under the Obama administration, although AFRICOM was formed under Bush, under the Obama administration, the AFRICOM project has been strengthened and enhanced, resulting in the occupation of Somalia through proxy military forces from Uganda and Burundi and Sierra Leone and other countries, Ethiopia, in Africa, as well as the massive bombing and regime change campaign against Libya in 2011, where they flew 26,000 bombing missions and dropped at least 9,600 bombs over Libya, where they engaged in a naval blockade, an arms embargo against the government, but then they armed rebels to more or less follow the pattern of the bombing throughout Libya. They seized over $160 billion in national assets from Libya, which they still have not returned, even under the counter-revolutionary government there now. And we look and see what's happening in Libya now. It's total chaos. Thousands of people are in prison, and we hear nothing from the State Department. We hear nothing from these so-called human rights organizations who were talking about the Gaddafi government, but says absolutely nothing, about the General National Congress government, which was installed by the U.S. imperialists at NATO. And then yesterday in Benghazi, there was a massacre of people who were protesting against a militia group where a number of people were killed in Benghazi. And it even led to the killing of the U.S. ambassador, Christopher Stevens, last September 11th, who in fact was a CIA official in Libya and throughout North Africa. Now, the White House announced in December of 2012 that it was dispatching 3,500 special forces in nearly 36 countries throughout Africa. Since January, the French have invaded and occupied their former colony in Mali in West Africa, which was supported logistically by the Pentagon. We had a workshop yesterday where a woman who was in Mali at the time of the French intervention said she witnessed U.S. military aircraft flying in French troops and military equipment to actually facilitate this intervention by France into Mali. The U.S. was responsible for the destabilization of Mali anyway through its military training programs that mentored Captain Amadou Sanogo, who was the titular head of the coup against the government in Bamako in March of 2012. The resultant chaos in Mali was utilized as a pretext for France to engage in its current intervention in that West African state. In neighboring Niger, right next to Mali, a uranium-rich state, which is also a former French colony, the U.S. has deployed at least 100 special forces to operate a drone station that is a threat to the people throughout the region of West as well as North Africa. Nonetheless, these military adventures in Africa have not improved the conditions of the peoples of the continent or the United States. Economic crises have intensified throughout Europe and North America. And a degree of political repression is reaching new heights with police terrorism, the killing of civilians here in New York and cities throughout the country, mass incarceration, which is continuing. Over 2.5 million people in the United States are incarcerated. It has the highest per capita prison population of any other country throughout the world. The attacks on immigrant communities where under this administration, over 1 million immigrants have been deported by the Obama administration over the last 4 years. And then you have the widespread surveillance, data mining, the tracking of phone calls and emails by the National Security Agency and other intelligence forces in the country. And this is, absolutely amazing that this is taking place, and it's actually been leaked. And also you have the eradication of basic bourgeois democratic rights that have reached unprecedented levels. Like in Detroit, where I'm from, they imposed emergency management, meaning that the mayor and the city council virtually have no power whatsoever in the city. You have the banks essentially dictating public policy in the city of Detroit. And they're demanding that the people of the city of Detroit pay them what they say we owe them, which is $16.9 billion. It's absolutely outrageous. And our position is, in Detroit, we don't owe the banks anything. They owe us because they destroyed the city through their predatory lending, through the fraudulent loans and bond deals, which we have gotten the documents from in a Freedom of Information request earlier this year, and they're posted on the Moratorium Now website, and I can talk about that later. These developments require the adoption of a clear anti-imperialist position in all aspects of our mass work. So even if we're working against the municipal crisis, even if we're working against the closing of schools, if we're working against the attacks on public transportation, we have to relate these struggles to the overall economic crisis and the role of the Pentagon budget in draining the national treasury of the United States. The struggle against the financial strangulation of the cities through home foreclosures, evictions, utility shutoffs, the elimination of municipal services, the evisceration of public education, the attacks on Social Security and Medicaid. They have a plan now to attack Social Security, to change the cost of living formulas. So those of us who are looking forward to retirement, we're going to get less money as the cost of living is going up. And medical services as well, because of the sequester, hospitals now are starting to lay off, despite Obamacare. This must be linked with the rising military budgets of the imperialist states, coupled with the aggressive interventions throughout Africa, throughout the Middle East, throughout Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific regions. The linking of these movements around the world will provide us with the political capacity to encircle imperialism, which Che Guevara talked about during the 1960s. These efforts are fundamentally the same in their character, and the liberation of peoples internationally will inevitably strengthen our struggle inside the United States. And that concludes my remarks, and we should put more than